Hello and welcome to this fantasy football discussion on the RBB channel. I'm Malaki and I'm joined by the reigning RBB fantasy football champion, Disciple.
Hi, thank you. It's good to be here and have a chat. It'll be fun to get started with the new season.
New season kicks off pretty soon, just a week or so away. And of course, most people are now looking at their drafts. The drafts are probably the most important basis to get the season started and to kick off your team in the right kind of way. And you won it all last year. So, Disciple, how did you go about working out who to pick for your draft?
Well, I think the first thing is that I've drafted right at the end of the first round. So my draft pick was one of the last picks. That changes my strategy a little bit. So I knew that the top players, which were going to be in a PPR league, you're going to have your top running backs go in the top 3 or 4 picks. That's just the way it goes with McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley. So because they were going early, you then have to see what's the best value you're going to get at that position. So the way that I approached that strategy was to make sure that I looked at where the best value for position was. And it was clear to me that the biggest difference in value was in tight ends, where you had 2 or 3 top choices and everything else dropped off a cliff really quickly. And I thought that you could get value in every other position further down. So my strategy basically was to take the best tight end available, who would give me really consistent points throughout the season and be a kind of a gun player for me every week and outperform most tight ends most weeks. Not necessarily the best every week, but that every week could give me a really good consistent basis and be ahead of all the other players in the position. And that would be the backbone of my team for the entire season. Following that, my next pick after Travis Kelce was Julio Jones, because again, I saw that the value at running back I thought was quite deep in last year's draft, and I thought you could get good value further down. And I wanted to get, again, a really consistent performer who was going to be strong throughout the season. And the reason I think that is because you can pick up in free agency as well other players, and you get injuries more in running back. So I kind of see the value in a top wide receiver who's done it year in, year out for 7-8 seasons, consistently getting 1,000 yards a year. That's the kind of player that you want in your team, who's going to give you that consistent 15 to 20 points. That's a good starting position for the team, and then you build around that with other players. So that was how I approached my one. So you picked in a different position to me, though, didn't you? So what did you start with? You took McCaffrey, didn't you?
Yeah, so I was picking much higher. I was picking 4, and frankly, I was a little bit lucky because McCaffrey fell to me, and it could easily have gone a little bit earlier than 4, but he came to me, and it was a no-brainer at 4 to go for McCaffrey, because he's a really good running back who racks up loads of yards, but in a points per reception league, he's going to get a lot of catches, so he's going to get a lot of added value compared to other running backs as well, because he's just a dual threat.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really does make a difference in PPR to have that. And knowing that those big running backs that were going to be the monsters in PPR were gone early, I then had to change my strategy on running back for when I picked. So my strategy then was volume backs. So the running backs who are going to take the ball consistently, be the number 1 running back and run the ball 20, 25 times a game. So my strategy then became, who are those feature backs? Not the running back by committee like San Francisco or somewhere else where you're not sure who's going to be number 1 each week. So I didn't want to pick a running back by committee, because the San Francisco model, you don't know which back's going to be featured in any game. So if you pick one, by week 2 or week 3, they could have been rotated for a different back, depending on who the defence is and depending on what the offensive strategy is. So I really wanted to go for the big hitters, and that's how I ended up with Henry and Carson.
Henry did you really well, to be fair, and he was great in the run into the playoffs. I mean, my own second choice running back came in middle rounds of the draft, and I went for Aaron Jones. And I went for him partly because he was on the board and looked to have good value at the pick that I made him at, but also because in the offense in Green Bay, there's the prospect of him getting a reasonable amount of touchdowns, even if he's not a huge volume player. And he did do pretty well for me last season. He was a pretty solid RB2, and he gave me enough points to win a few games. He did, of course, lose me a game when he dropped a game-winning touchdown against Mushka last season, and that cost me a loss. But I stayed with him, and he did pretty well. But I don't think I'd pick him this year. And I certainly wouldn't pick him early this year, even though he got quite a lot of points last year, and he still looks to have value. And the reason for that is that there's a new rookie in Green Bay, A.J. Dillon, and I think Dillon may well be on the field in short yardage, goal-to-go situations. He's likely to vulture a lot of touchdowns because he's a big guy. So I probably wouldn't pick Jones just because of this risk of losing points out to A.J. Dillon.
Yeah, I completely agree. And AJ Dillon is 6 foot, 245-pound monster. So he's exactly the kind of guy you want in those yardage situations. And that's one of the reasons I took Henry. I wasn't expecting Henry to be the monster that he ended up being for me last season, but I knew that he was a goal line back. I mean, he's just a monster of a human being. You give him the ball and he just trucks it over the line. What they did the previous year isn't necessarily going to be replicated in the next year, and that's especially true when teams draft running backs. And rookie running backs and second-year running backs often have a lot of value to add to a team that can take away from a feature back's role. So that's definitely a way that I'll be planning my strategy this year as well, is to look at who's going to be likely to get those kind of touches in important positions and important times, and who's valued by their team to be that feature guy.
Absolutely, and you can't be sure that you're going to get consistent production week in, week out. I went relatively early last year at wide receiver for Tyreek Hill, who is a really great wide receiver, and he's one of the fastest players in the NFL. He has Patrick Mahomes throwing to him, but Patrick Mahomes got injured, and Tyreek Hill got injured. And so I actually lost a whole bunch of value last season out of Tyreek Hill that I thought I was going to get after picking him early. That was one of the lessons for me from last year, is it's not just about what you pick early, it's about the depth that you pick and looking through the later rounds as well to try and compensate for what could happen to the players at the top.
Yeah, I completely agree. And obviously being a PPR league, one of the things you do want to look for are potentially volume receivers, slot guys. Julian Edelman's, he's always been a fantasy star because of that. Now he gets picked earlier, but there are other players like him who have that potential to make a large number of catches but may not get the touchdown volume that others will. And wide receiver is probably the deepest position to do that. You don't know quite who's going to break out. Cortland Sutton last year had a monster year. Darius Slayton had a great year at the Giants as rookies, both of them. So you can see some rookies would do that, but generally you're looking at second year, third year guys at the beginning of the draft, or really experienced pros that are on a team like a Golden Tate or someone like that who is a volume receiver. They're really valuable and you can pick them up. And I think that they're the people you need to look at in the later rounds, because the later rounds are actually where you can do exceptionally well in the draft and it can really set your team up going forwards. You take some potentially high volume players, some boom or bust players, and then you've also got those as your potential guys to drop on the waiver wire if you find someone else that you want to pick up. So it's about flexibility later on. Who could potentially come up and do something is potentially not likely to, who you could potentially drop in the future because you know you're going to be changing your team. And that's one of the key things I always focused on. You're going to change your team. And if you're going to change your team during the season, you can't just focus on the draft in having boom and bust. So at the top of the draft, I really, really focused on performers week in, week out. And for Kelsey and Julio Jones, I had that all year. Now, Jones doesn't get the touchdowns he should. I don't understand why at Atlanta. He's just never quite got the volume of touchdowns. But he'd get 100 and 150 yards some games, and it would just rack it up. Towards the end of the season, he was a monster for me. Even when Mahomes was out, I was getting the same from Kelsey because he was the trusted receiver. So the backups would go in there, throw the ball to Kelsey, so he'd still get volume production. Those are the kind of guys that you want to be looking for, and they're the kind of guys that I kind of stake my draft strategies on in general, that consistency at the top of the draft.
So we talked quite a lot about receivers, runners, tight ends, these kind of players, but the marquee position in the sport is, of course, the quarterback. And there's always a bit of a tension in fantasy football. When do you go for a quarterback? We had a pick 3 in the first round last season was put on a quarterback by the Bearded Wonder, and it didn't really pan out. It wasn't a pick that got a huge amount of points, and maybe that was a bit of bad luck because Mahomes got injured. And so he missed, I think, 4 starts, and then he took a couple of games to get himself back in again. But picking a quarterback, when? There's a real temptation when you see a little bit of a run on quarterbacks. Now you have to go for one because there actually aren't that many great starters in the NFL who can rack up consistent points on a week-to-week basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw last year the extraordinary power of Lamar Jackson. And whoever had him in many fantasy leagues, luckily for me, not in ours, Lamar Jackson generally won most leagues for people because his numbers were absolutely monstrous. Now, he could actually be a candidate to go in the top 4 or 5 picks of the draft, and it wouldn't surprise me at all. As we say about value for the position, he could outperform the position by quite a considerable amount just because of his running stats on top of his passing stats. and the efficiency of the number of touchdowns per throw is staggering. So yeah, I mean, quarterback is a key one. I mean, I went for Aaron Rodgers for my quarterback. I didn't have a particularly good year the year before, but there was a new coach going in with a new regime, and I thought that they would rely on Rodgers to elevate the team in Green Bay with that wonderful connection he has with Devontae Adams. So I kind of went probably without looking enough into the detail and recognising that the new coach was actually much more of a running-based coach, and they put in a really running-based strategy, and Rodgers didn't shine for me at all. So I picked later on for my quarterback, and I took one that I thought was going to have a really good, consistent production. Again, that same theme around consistency week in, week out. And that's where I want my starting team to be. But it didn't really work out for me at all at quarterback. And I ended up having to stream quarterbacks week in, week out based on opposition. And I think that's actually a viable option as well. That there is value in free agency because there are 32 starters each week. Who knows who's going to be playing the worst defense each week? Who knows which team's going to be the worst defense each week? And if you can pick that guy up, then actually quarterback isn't the most important player to pick, because when you're breaking them down, positions sort of 4 to 10 to 12 aren't that different in terms of numbers, and they really are week to week, which will be better than another.
Yeah, I had Rodgers on the board when I was picking quarterback, and it was tempting, but that was one thing I was a little bit wary of what was going to happen in Green Bay. I think I'd be even warier this season to look at Rodgers, given the trend that seems to be going on there towards a much more running-based offense. And I went with Tom Brady. And it was kind of an old reliable in terms of that pick. I was looking for basically someone who is unlikely to throw many goose eggs, unlikely to be a negative for my team. And I picked him in combination with Julian Edelman. And that combination did win me a couple of matches towards the start and middle of the season. But he tailed off really badly. And by the time he tailed off, there just weren't that many quarterbacks to stream, because smarter coaches than me, like yourself, had picked up all the good ones.
You mean like Fitzmagic? Fitzmagic was a wonder for me. And the Miami transformation last season, I think they're going to be really good again this year. Parker for them was absolutely amazing. He won me games going into the end of the season. He was an unbelievable pickup. Yeah, so I absolutely, there are players around that you can pick up mid-season. But I think that raises a question around Brady for this year as well. Was that tail off last year his age catching up with him? Was it the fact that there were injuries, the fact that they were just beat up on the offense? I don't know. And I think that puts a real question mark over him at the Bucks, and the whole Bucks offense is going to rely basically on, is Tom Brady good enough to carry that offense in the way that he has before and play to the level of the simply unbelievable quality he has outside him in wide receiver and tight end and running back? Or is his play simply in decline? So that's the kind of thing that we need to consider this year. And we could look at Phillip Rivers as being a perfect example alongside that. He's had a pretty poor year by his standards last year. And now he's gone to the team with probably the best offensive line in football, a great young rookie running back to support it, a really good wide receiver in T.Y. Hilton. Is he going to elevate his game back up to the level you'd expect, or has his decline simply set in? I think those are the kind of questions with experienced older quarterbacks that really need to be taken into account, because you just don't know what's going to happen. And that's why sometimes you pick one that you hope is going to be reliable, and then you can potentially stream them during the season.
I actually picked Rivers. He had a couple of good games, but mostly it was a nightmare, and then eventually he had to go. But it's a really interesting point looking ahead to this year and the differences that there might be. I mean, a team like the Bucks, for me, that's a boom or bust team. There could be an enormous amount of points scored there, but equally it could all go horribly wrong, and they might not get many points at all this season for fantasy owners. So it's a risk-based decision. It's not necessarily one where you're looking for certainty, you'd go to the Bucks. But if you're looking for maybe a little bit of magic, you might find it there. Roll the dice, take the risk. Maybe another boom or bust team that could be considered is probably Arizona.
Yeah, agree. Interesting quarterback situation. Is this going to be a breakout year for Murray, that he can explode in the same way Lamar Jackson did? There's a very good chance to say that he will. His running ability is excellent. His passing ability is excellent. He's got an eye for it. He puts it in the right places, and he has a coach who wants to drive that offense into big yards, lots of plays, big points. So that's going to be a really interesting situation. Yeah, I don't know quite what's going to happen with them this year, but Kyler Murray could be the kind of quarterback that goes under the radar in the draft to come. Could be one to pick up. Moving on from quarterbacks, though, I did notice that you picked up a defense quite early in last season. You picked up one of the top defenses for the year, and that seems to be quite a good play out for you.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of picking up defenses. They don't score anywhere near the number of points on a consistent basis that a running back or a really top-end wide receiver will secure a team. But I'm a big fan, not just of picking a good defense, but of picking two defenses. I like to have two defenses on my team, and I like to be in a position where these defenses could possibly be matched up on a week-to-week basis. And I can switch in, stream them between each other based on where I can find terrible offenses. And so I'm looking at defenses like Chicago, like Baltimore, these kind of defenses that consistently, year in, year out, do seem to perform better than average at the position. There are lots of defenses in the league that just don't rack up points. They might spike 1 or 2 weeks, but I actually wanted to go for Chicago last season, but I was beaten to it by someone who picked earlier, actually. It was Mushka in our league. But Baltimore, always a good choice. Equally, a choice that seems to work out quite a lot. A team like Denver, San Francisco seems to be a high-scoring defense. There are probably half a dozen defenses that this year should pick up good points. There are teams that will outscore other defenses by a factor of 3 or 4 on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's probably my weakest point last season. Is I was in that position where I was literally looking as to who was playing who on a weekly basis and trying to get the best I could. I ended up doing that at quarterback and defense. Quarterback, it didn't work out too badly, and I ended up with Fitzmagic towards the end of the season. But on defense, I was constantly looking for matchups to who was going to be the best. But maybe not necessarily just 1 week ahead, maybe the next run of games. So would they be okay in the next 3 or 4 games? So I wouldn't just want to look at one game ahead and go, oh, this week they've got an easy game. If they've got one easy game, but then I need to drop them and get another one, then I'm putting the risk on that I'm not going to be able to get a good defense. So I was schedule watching further down the season to say, okay, so these 3 or 4 games, this defense looks like it's going to be quite good. So I try and pick up a team, even if it wasn't the best for one, would be more consistent over a higher number of games. So my strategy wasn't just week to week for that. My defensive strategy was kind of a couple of weeks, 2 to 3, maybe 4 weeks of a selection of a team. But yeah, I could definitely see value in picking a defense I heard earlier up, and I do agree. I think there are about 6 or so, maybe 7 defenses that look really good this year. It's a shame that the Chargers lost their starting safety. That's a real shame because I thought they could be a really, really good defense, and that's just going to take the gloss off them and bring them down to the pack again. But yeah, the Steelers haven't been mentioned, the Bills haven't been mentioned. I think those are both excellent defenses to add as well.
Schedule watching is an interesting one. You schedule watched really well because it was the run-in to the final set of games, basically the last 2 or 3 weeks of the regular season plus the 2 games in the postseason, where your team was at its strongest. And so through the season, up to that point, up to about week 10 or so, you were a contender. But your team really kicked on at the end because you had not just relied on what you got at the start, you managed to pick up what was important for the finish.
Absolutely, and I think it was about week 7 or 8 that I took that strategy on more aggressively, and I literally would plan which teams are bad. I knew that Washington were playing in week 16 with a rookie quarterback at one point, and as soon as they put Haskins in, I was like, that is the offense that I'm going to be running against. I need the defense that's going to play that. I'd have that kind of mindset. I knew that Miami had a quite easy run in, and they were scoring points, so I put Fitzpatrick and Parker in, and they both were played out in exactly the way that I hoped they would. That was absolutely my strategy going in towards the end, and which are the strongest and which are the weakest teams. I think you can't really know that at the beginning of the season. You can't know that in the draft, and you have to have that kind of idea going in towards the end of the season. If you want to win the last games, you need the players that are going to perform in a one-off game. It's a Super Bowl, it's a final. You've got to have your players performing on the day, and to do that, you've got to get the best matchups. So, what are the best Week 16 matchups? End of story. And that was basically my strategy, and I played it from about 8 weeks out. I got to a position where I had an unbelievable confidence in my team, and going into the final, I felt that I could put any player out there and they were going to get me at least double digits, and I almost got that in my entire team. I almost got that in the final. That almost played out perfectly for me. So that was my winning strategy. That was why I won last year. That was the main reason for it. It wasn't necessarily the draft. It was definitely that play out from week 8 towards week 16, working out who I would have, hoping I get in, not neglecting the current games, but planning for the future, having a couple of players that I'd have not necessarily playing week in, week out, but I'd have saved up for the last couple of weeks. That was key goal and key strategy that I wanted to try and apply.
So this season, you're picking 11. What does that mean for your strategy? What does it mean to be picking 11 in a 12-team league?
Having 12 teams, it means that you have to reassess depth of position. Once again, it looks like there are going to be certain positions that are maybe going to be slightly less depth. So it might be that those need to be the positions targeted early. Or you just take a gamble and you don't go for those and you try and stream somebody in that. So at tight end, if you don't pick up one of the top tight ends, maybe you pick later on in a round 6, round 7, you pick up a tight end there that's going to be a good player for you. And maybe you couple that with picking a good defense and picking one of the top quarterbacks. So I think the strategy has to be rounded. If you need to have top players and you need to have consistency from them. Injuries always come in, as you said about Mahomes last season. That was a gutting injury to see. So those kind of things you can't legislate for, but what you do need to do is have that same mindset of picking for value. So because I'm picking at number 11, I know the top running backs will be gone. I know probably the top 1, maybe 2 wide receivers will be gone. I know probably the top 1, maybe 2 quarterback will be gone, and potentially a couple of tight ends could be gone from there. I just don't know what's going to be around when I get to that position. So it will be about value, but it won't just be next man up. It will be an overall strategy based on my first pick. I will then have a strategy for the rest of the draft. If I pick a quarterback, then I'll then be planning the rest of my strategy around that. If I pick a tight end, I'll be planning the rest of my strategy around that. If I pick up a running back, do I go 3 in a row? 1, 2, 3 running back strategy is quite popular to give you that consistency, those running backs who will be there in the first few weeks to get you going. But you can always change further down the line because is the running back depth there at the moment? Are too many teams in running back by committee? So are there enough top end high performing running backs? I don't know. I think that's part of the strategy that needs to go into it, I think, and that's the way that I'm currently viewing it and working out where I want to go when it comes to it.
Yeah, so I'm picking in the middle. I'm picking number 7. And just looking at the depth, it looks to me like I probably could get a running back because there's probably at least half a dozen elite running backs. And there are other players in other positions, such as wide receiver or even quarterback. There's probably one that could well be considered in the top 6 for value. So it looks to me like running back might fall to me. If it doesn't, I imagine I might go for elite wide receiver. But then the interesting thing about picking in the middle is you have to read and react. You don't have the luxury that you might have at picking at one end, where you can pick 2 players in a relatively short amount of time. So if you're picking number 12, you're also picking number 13. If you're picking number 1, you pick first, but you don't have a pick for a very long time, and then you have a couple of them. Whereas when you're picking in the middle, it's much more read and react. It's much more working out what is available now, and also looking at what is disappearing off the board and where I might lose value if I don't pick something now. If I don't pick, say, a wide receiver in round 2, will there be a credible wide receiver for me until round 4 or 5, and I'm looking at depth rather than quality. So interesting challenges depending on where you pick. The top of the draft, there do seem to be some very high scoring potential players, but last season at the top of the draft, players like Saquon Barkley didn't pan out. If you pick a player at the top of the draft who doesn't perform quite as well, and then you don't pick for a very long time until you get to the end of round 2, say, your strategy will have to adapt on the basis of what else has gone off the board. And that's definitely what I'm going to be looking at. What is going off the board, given where I am in the middle? And what I definitely don't want to be doing is picking the next best player, because when I did a mock draft, I just kept getting wide receivers, and frankly that meant that I could well be doing excellently the wide receiver position, but I have nothing else really to show for it, and that's not going to win me the title.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is about that balanced team. You can't. Question is, do you focus on one? And I think the question is, do you focus on running back early, or do you have a diversified strategy? And I think there are probably, depending on where you pick, that does make a difference. Obviously, if you're picking in the middle rounds and you end up getting the number 1 wide receiver, and I think we all know who the top receiver is expected to be this year, then I think that you've got that chance to build from that and then pad out the running back 1 and 2 positions, and then your flex can be a tight end or running back. And I think that's the other point around the draft. You don't necessarily need 3 running backs, but you need to have 5 skill players, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, and a flex. Now, if your flex player is of a really good standard, and that can be the best player available. So if your strategy in the top 4 rounds is to focus on those 4 key positions, wide receiver and running back, and then your flex player is just the next player up that you think is going to be the best player, that can also be a viable strategy. So I do think the use of a flex player and how you assess your value in flex is actually really important, because you don't know if it's going to be a running back or a wide receiver. Wide receivers have the potential to go off the charts. Running backs are generally more consistent. Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma.
Yep, it's a dilemma we're going to be having to face as we look at our drafts. Any last tips for potential drafters?
Yeah, my tip would be just pick defenses in the first round. So when it gets to me, I can pick Saquon Barkley or Christian McCaffrey.
Good tip. Do take that on board, everybody. Make sure that you all go defense for the first 10 picks, so that leaves all the best players on the board. Unlikely to be the case, but you never know. My personal tip would definitely be to make sure that whatever it is that I want to pick at 7, you haven't just picked at 6, whoever you are. Make sure that you don't just steal something just in front of me, because that's always the most annoying thing in the draft. When you're lining up some player, you're lining up some position, and the person in front of you just vultures it. It's so annoying, and you have to not overreact because you've only got 2 minutes to pick. And if you overreact in those 2 minutes thinking that was the guy I wanted, then you're going to make a mistake and just pick the next best player.
Yeah, absolutely. Multiple players, you need to have a multiple point strategy. So you need to have an if and or player. If this is here, I do this. Or if this is here, I do this. If not, I do that. You have to have that kind of mindset going into it. And if you don't, you're really going to mess up your own strategy.
Great. Looking forward to seeing how these strategies play out. I think it's going to be an exciting draft. It's a complicated year. And it's going to be another exciting one for fantasy football. I'd like to thank you, Disciple, for joining us today, and looking forward to seeing how your team does, whether you can repeat as champion for the RBB Fantasy Football League.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to the year.
And thank you all for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the RBB channel for fantasy football discussion and much, much more.